Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third lecture in Unit 2 on our series on political science. This lecture is going to be on classical liberalism. And classical liberalism also emerges, much like structural realism, as a bit of a counter to classical realism. And just to recap, for classical realists, for realists in general, the world is anarchic, and the only actors that matter are states. Those states are considered to be rational, self-interested. The world is more or less a self-help system where you have to help yourself. You can't really rely on people to come and bail you out and help you unless it's in their own interest. You maintain peace through the strategic use of balancing of power. And so for classical realists, at least, unlike structural realists, the most stable system is ultimately multipolar, as we said. Classical realists, as we said, has its basis in Morgenthau, but draws significantly from Hobbes. And bear that in mind, because that's going to become sort of important here, because this difference between realism and liberalism is really going to mirror a difference of opinion that we saw in Unit 1. And before I move on, I want to make something clear. Liberalism in international relations has nothing to do with liberalism in domestic politics. Nothing at all. In fact, sometimes you have many leftists that are realists and many right-wingers that are liberals when it comes to international relations. This is not, it's called liberalism, but has nothing to do with liberalism the way we understand liberalism. The key assumption for realism, however, is that the world is anarchic, and so conflict between states is more or less inevitable. War is just another tool of diplomacy. And so the question that liberalism starts off with is, well, is that true? I mean, is it true that the world is anarchic and military power is the only thing that matters and that countries build and build and build their military power? Well, liberals say, military power is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. And the international system, sure, there's plenty of opportunity for conflict, but there's also opportunity for cooperation. There's definitely places that we can work together in international relations. Unlike realists, liberals really put a lot of faith, a lot of importance in markets, in money, and in prosperity. Because ultimately, liberals argue that the international system is not always violent and anarchic, and it isn't always a self-help system. Collaboration isn't only possible, it's kind of preferable. Right? It's preferable to work together than to have antagonistic relationships. Unlike realists, who view military power as the only metric of power, liberals study wealth. So take the country of North Korea, for example. For realists, North Korea is a really powerful country because it has a large military, it has nukes, and it is able to carve out a space for itself and maintain its independence, and people listen when North Korea speaks, including the United States. But for liberals, they say North Korea is a really poor country. It's a really weak country because all of the nukes in the world will serve you nothing if you do not have food, if you do not have wealth, if you do not have the means to satisfy your people. And so North Korea, for liberals, is a very weak country. And because collaboration is possible, and because wealth is power, liberals, unlike realists, and this is really important, say that power is not zero-sum. It's not relative. There's definitely places where we can both get what we want, and it's not a system of winners and losers. We can both be winners. Now, because the metric is wealth, sure, states are important, but they're not the only actors that matter. They also have international institutions, the UN, the IMF, the WTO, etc. Interest groups, as much as they have financial power, so Amnesty International, for example. NGOs, like the Rockefeller Foundation, and finally, multinational corporations. So Apple, Nestle, General Electric, Walmart, etc. All of these actors are important because they have strong financial power. So, given what we know, the world's not anarchic, wealth is the metric, these are the actors. What does the world actually look like? What's it look like? Well, because collaboration is possible and power is a zero sum, the world isn't always anarchic. The world isn't that bad. Sure, it can start that way. We can start off from a place of unspeakable violence and destruction, much like the world after World War II. But unlike realists, liberals say, well, there's no reason to think that it would stay that way. Everything changes. We escape total and universal anarchy in the international system through the use of institutions where actors collaborate and provide organization to the international system. We provide that organization. It's not the distribution of power. It's institutions where we come together and collaborate that create that organization. These institutions, however, are more than just organizational tools. They're channels of cooperation. So, for example, the example I give here is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Sure, the World Trade Organization helps organize global trade and ensures that it operates smoothly, but it also facilitates cooperation between countries that are a part of it. It's a lot easier for countries that are in the WTO to work together than one country that's in it compared to a country that's not in it. It helps facilitate that cooperation. The textbook example that liberals point to when showing how the system can work is the conflict between France and Germany. This conflict between France and Germany caused most of the conflict in Europe all the way back to the 1800s. It caused the Napoleonic Wars, it caused the Prussian Wars, it caused 2 world wars. By the end of World War II, enough was enough. And so immediately afterwards, a solution is found to avoid conflict, and it is called the European Coal and Steel Community. It contains these countries to start, the ECSC, and it was a way through which these countries would pool together coal and steel resources in order to help facilitate production. And this is important because by facilitating cooperation between these former enemies, it made them interdependent. And that's really important. If you want to go to war and you want to create weapons, coal and steel are up there with resources that you will need. If you think, I need to build tanks today, what do I need? I need coal for my factories and steel to build the tanks with. If I'm sharing those resources with France and with the Netherlands and other countries that I might be invading, well then I can no longer do that. I am dependent on France for those resources. I am dependent on Italy for those resources, etc., etc. And so by making France and Germany and Italy and the Netherlands and Belgium interdependent, they made conflict between these countries impossible. And this little coal and steel community is the first step into what will become the European Union. The European Union starts as the European Coal and Steel Community. And it's important to understand this because, again, liberals stress this. Interdependence makes countries really unlikely to enter into conflict. And so you want to encourage interdependence as a path to both peace and prosperity. So let's take 4 countries, for example. I have here China, the United States, Brazil, and Australia. And let's say each and every one of them is trading a certain good with each other. In so doing, they've become interdependent because they are relying on each other for certain staple goods. Economic interdependence makes military conflict impossible. Think about a country like China compared to the United States. As much as we hum and we haw about it, the US and China will never, ever, ever go to war because they are too interdependent on one another for that to be economically viable. We need China because they make all our stuff, and China needs us because we buy all their stuff. We are economically interdependent. They need us, and we need them. And that has made military conflict impossible. Not conflict in general. Like, there's going to be places where the US and China do not agree and will argue. But they're never going to go to war with each other over those issues because they are too interdependent. Now, the key text from which this comes out of is a work by Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye, two political scientists, called Power and Interdependence. And the text literally starts off with the line, "We live in an era of interdependence." That's the first line of the book. And it continues, "The old international patterns are crumbling. The old slogans are uninstructive. The old solutions are unavailing. The world has become interdependent in economics, in communication, and in human aspirations. Political leaders often use interdependence rhetoric to portray interdependence as a natural necessity, as something that we need, as a fact to which many policy and domestic interest groups must adjust. They usually argue that conflicts of interest are reduced by interdependence, and that cooperation alone provides the answer to the world's problems. By collaborating economically, through trade, through wealth production, we are able to provide concrete solutions to the world problems." That's the promise of liberalism. And they will admit, we are not suggesting that international conflict disappears when interdependence prevails. On the contrary, conflict will take new forms and may even increase, right? Conflict is not going to go away anytime soon. But the traditional approaches to understanding conflict will not explain interdependence conflict particularly well. And so here's the example I gave before. The US and China, we are not friends, right? No one, if you made a list of America's friends, China would not be amongst those countries. But they are interdependent. And so conflicts between the US and China are never going to involve military power and military conflict. So what is interdependence? We've said this word a lot. Well, dependence means a state of being determined or significantly affected by external forces. So interdependence just means mutual dependence. So interdependence in world politics refers to situations characterized by reciprocal effects amongst countries or actors in different countries. So for example, the actions of Apple in America has effects in China, and vice versa, the actions of, say, Huawei has impacts in the United States. So why are the US and China interdependent? Because China is dependent on American consumers, investors, and business demand, whereas we are dependent on Chinese manufacturing and supply chain. They're dependent on us to buy their things and invest in their companies, and we are dependent on their manufacturing and supply chain. The difference between realism and liberalism is not just the difference between a world of zero-sum and non-zero-sum. Remember, realists are zero-sum, liberals are not. Military independence need not be zero-sum. Indeed, military allies seek interdependence to provide to provide security for all. So the example that liberals often talk about is NATO. NATO is an example of how interdependence can work in military affairs. NATO has moved on from being a tool through which America can protect herself and her allies in the Cold War to now simply being the collection of America's friends. But it is true that America spends significantly more on NATO than any other country. But doesn't mean that we don't gain anything from NATO. We do. We gain friendship, we gain military support to varying degrees, but something is better than nothing. And so they seek interdependence with us, and we seek interdependence with them. And together we all benefit. But what Keohane and Nye argue is that not only do we live in these, simple sort of binary types of interdependence. We live in this world of complex interdependence, where not only are we interdependent, but we're also interdependent in a whole bunch of different ways. So here are the three main characteristics of complex interdependence. Countries and societies are tied together in different ways, and not all of them involve states. This is more than just a relationship between countries. American multinational corporations, are reliant on Japanese consumers. Japanese electronics companies are reliant on Chinese manufacturing. And all of these things combine into complex interdependence. Multiple channels connect societies, including informal ties between government elites, as well as formal foreign office arrangements, informal ties among non-governmental elites, and transnational organizations. We are complexly interdependent. We have friends. We have formal relationships and informal relationships. So think of something as silly as air travel. Air travel is a miracle if you think about it from an international relations perspective. Think about how many countries need to be on board with ensuring that air travel works correctly in order to get people from all sorts of different countries to fly from, say, Los Angeles to Dubai. Think about how many countries need to be involved with that. You can fly right now from LA to Dubai on an Australian airline. That's crazy. That's only something that can exist, according to liberals, in a world like the one they are describing, one that is complexly interdependent. These actors are important not only because of their activities in the pursuit of their own interests, but because they act as transmission belts, making government policies in various countries more sensitive to one another, right? So, for example, when Apple does business in, say, India, it is not acting in the interests of the United States. It is acting in the interests of Apple Inc. However, they're transmission belts, making countries more receptive to one another. In this case, making the US and India more sensitive to each other's issues. And so there are a whole wide variety of issues in the system beyond just national security. And the variety of issues provides a variety of channels for collaboration between actors. So domestic policy issues become foreign policy issues, and vice versa. There's no hierarchy here. It's all relevant when it comes to interdependence. The agenda, this is the third one, the agenda of interstate relations consists of multiple issues that are not arranged in a clear and consistent hierarchy. And this means that, among other things, military security does not constantly dominate the agenda. Military security is important, but it's not the only thing countries debate about. And when there are multiple issues on the agenda, sorry, a bit of a typo there, many of which threaten the interests of domestic groups, but do not clearly threaten the nation as a whole, the problems of formulating a coherent and consistent foreign policy increase. Think tariffs, for example. And so third, military force becomes a non-option between countries experience complex interdependence. Allies don't often threaten each other militarily, for example. If the US is angry at Canada, the US does not threaten to invade Canada. And if Canada is upset at the United States, they don't threaten to send the Mounties over the border. That's not how this works. All right? Military force is not used by governments towards other governments with the region or on the issues when complex interdependence prevails. It may, however, be important in these governments' relations with governments outside that region or on other issues. So, for example, military intervention is not an option when we talk business with, say, Canada. But it is an option when we talk business when we say Syria. That's just the nature of the game. Again, military power for liberals is a tool, but one that should be avoided. It's just not a good way of getting what you want. Among industrialized, pluralist countries, the perceived margin of safety has widened. Fear of attack in general have declined. Sorry, another typo there. And fears of attack by one another are virtually non-existent. No one listening to this lecture, living in the United States, is objectively worried about a large ground-scale military invasion. Now, realists would argue that's because the United States is a strong country. But liberals would argue it's because we have created this, quote, Western world order in which we are complexly interdependent with one another. And that has essentially removed the need to go to war. War is passé. It's a bad way of getting the things that you want. If I'm the US and you're Canada and I really want maple syrup, I don't invade Canada and raid the maple syrup Federal Reserve, which, parentheses, is a real thing. Go Google it. Instead, I offer to buy it. I trade for it. That's sort of how this works. Moreover, force is often not an appropriate way of achieving other goals, such as economic and ecological welfare, and those are becoming increasingly more important. In situations, the effects of military force are both costly and uncertain. Liberals argue there's definitely better ways of getting what you want. Now, I hope that made sense. Classical liberalism is both easier and more complicated at the same time, depending on who you ask, than classical realism and realism in general. I hope that made sense. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me, and stay tuned for the next one. Bye-bye.